They called the orc woman cursed. The human put his ring on her hand anyway. She came over the ridge at dawn, and the first thing the Vethkai soldiers saw was the blood. It was not her blood. That much was obvious from the way she moved, unhurried, almost casual, her boots crunching over the shale of the high pass like she owned every stone. The blood was dark and iridescent, the color of oil on water, and it ran from a cut on her forearm where she had dragged the carcass of a Strathian war beast across her shoulder. The war beast weighed approximately 400 kilograms. She was carrying it one-handed, using her left. In her right she held an axe with a head the size of a bread loaf, and she was whistling something that no one in the garrison had ever heard before, and would never quite be able to get out of their heads afterward. The Vethkai had a word for humans who behaved this way. It translated loosely as those who have not yet been told they should be afraid. They used it in the same tone that other species used the word problem. Her name was Marin Solis, and she had been alone in the ashfields for 43 days. She dropped the war beast carcass at the checkpoint gate with a sound like a small avalanche, straightened up, and looked at the two Vethkai sentries through the morning fog. They were tall, nearly 3 meters, with the ridged facial bones and bioluminescent throat sacs that marked the warrior caste. Their armor was the deep copper of the Dominion 3rd Legion, and they were holding pulse lances that could reduce a human to component proteins in under a second. "I need water," Marin said, "and a map if you've got one, and whatever passes for breakfast around here." The sentries looked at each other. They looked at the war beast. They looked at her arm. "What happened to your arm?" one of them asked, in the clicking consonant language of the lowland Veth. She looked down at it. The cut was already closing. She'd packed it with dustroot, an old trick her father had taught her in the eastern settlements before the Dominion burned them. "War beast got a claw in before it died," she said. "I've had worse." She had, in fact, had worse. The scar that ran from her left ear to her collarbone was from a Dominion boarding action 8 years ago. The 3 parallel lines on her right hand were from something else entirely, something she didn't talk about in garrison checkpoints. The ring on her index finger, a plain band of hammered iron, dented and dark, had been her father's, and his father's before him, and she wore it like she wore her own skin, without thinking about it, as though removing it would require removing something more fundamental. The sentry who had spoken took a step toward her. "Humans are not permitted in the Ashfields corridor without." "I know," Marin said. "I was already there." "I'm coming out now." She tilted her head toward the carcass. War Beast had a feeding territory that overlapped with the eastern water access point. "I removed it. You're welcome." A long silence. The bioluminescence in the sentry's throat sac shifted through 3 colors: confusion, threat assessment, something that might have been the Veth equivalent of respect, though it didn't stay long. They let her through. The garrison town of Vethsal Crossing was not a place that liked humans, but it tolerated them the way a large animal tolerates a small one, without particular malice, but without warmth either. Marin had been through worse towns. She found a water station near the eastern market and drank until the ache behind her eyes subsided, then sat with her back against a wall and watched the morning traffic move through the narrow streets. The Vethkai were not subtle people. Everything about their architecture was designed to communicate hierarchy: the tallest structures for the warrior caste, the mid-tier structures for the administrators, the low sprawling buildings at the market edge for everyone else. Humans, when they appeared at all, occupied the margins. They hauled freight. They maintained the water processing equipment that the Veth found beneath their dignity. They existed in the negative space of Dominion civilization, filling the gaps that the hierarchy left behind. Marin watched a Veth warrior stride through the market and saw the crowd part without being asked. She watched a human girl of maybe 12 carry a load of pipe fitting on her back, twice her body weight, and disappear down an alley without anyone's eyes following her. She watched the sky, where two Dominion patrol craft moved in slow arcs over the settlement, and she thought about the 43 days she had spent in the ash fields, and the things she had found there and what it meant. She pulled the medallion from inside her shirt. It was a disc of something that was not quite metal, lighter, and warm to the touch even in cold air, with a pattern along the rim that she had never been able to fully decode. It had been in the war beast's stomach. That was not metaphorical. She had cut the animal open looking for water trapped in its gut bladder, and found this instead, along with the partial remains of what she was reasonably certain had been a Vethkai soldier. The medallion was not Veth-made. She knew enough about their metallurgy to be certain of that. It was not human-made either, though the proportions felt somehow scaled for human hands. She was still looking at it when the shadow fell across her. Marin did not look up immediately. She tucked the medallion back under her shirt, registered the size of the shadow, large, Veth-proportioned, and gauged the distance to the axe she'd propped against the wall at her left side. "Humans do not carry weapons in Vethsal Crossing," said a voice, female. Warrior cast resonance in the consonants, but something else underneath it, a quality she couldn't immediately name. Marin looked up. The Veth woman was tall even by Veth standards, with the deep gray-green coloration of the southern castes, and the kind of facial scarring that told a story in the visual grammar of Veth culture. 3 diagonal cuts across the right cheekbone, a mark Marin had seen before, in a cultural briefing she'd been given 7 years ago by a Dominion defector. It meant something like asterisk outcast, something like asterisk touched by ruin. The defector had translated it as asterisk she who brings death to those around her, and had said it in the way people say things they believe without needing to verify. The Veth woman's throat sack was flickering through colors that Marin couldn't read. She was carrying a spear that had seen significant use and a small pack that had seen more. She was, Marin noted, also carrying wounds, a deep pressure bruise along her left side that spoke of a pulse lance graze, and a wrapped joint on her right hand that suggested something had recently been dislocated and put back. "The axe is a tool," Marin said. "I use it for work." "What kind of work requires an axe in a garrison town?" "The kind that comes up unexpectedly." Marin studied the facial marks. "You're not Dominion, are you?" The flicker in the throat sack went cold and still, the way a fire goes still in the moment before a wind hits it. "What makes you say that?" "The marks," Marin said. "And the fact that you're looking at me like you're trying to decide whether I'm going to cause problems for you. Dominion soldiers don't look at humans like that. They look at us like whether something to be accounted for but not really engaged with." She tilted her head. "You're deciding. That's different." A very long pause. "There is a food stall 2 streets east," the Veth woman said finally. "The proprietor is human. He does not report to the garrison. If you have coin or something worth trading, come. If not, come anyway. I have questions." She turned and walked without waiting to see if Marin would follow. Marin picked up her axe and followed. The food stall was run by a man named Get who had the deep tan and permanent squint of someone who had spent decades under the Ashfield sun and made his peace with it. He nodded at the Veth woman with the ease of familiarity and set 2 plates down without being asked. The food was something Marin didn't have a name for, a grain she didn't recognize, cooked with something savory. But she ate it without ceremony because she was hungry and it was there, and that was the calculus she operated on. The Veth woman's name, given after a pause that suggested the sharing of it was not something she did lightly, was Gannis of the Ketville line, though she said the second part of that in the tone of someone reciting an address they no longer lived at. "The marks," Marin said. "What did you actually do?" Gannis ate for a moment before answering. The throat sack moved through a color that Get, watching from the corner of his eye, seemed to recognize and respect. "My line led a patrol against a human settlement on the Ketville Reach," she said. 11 years ago, I was sub-commander. I had my orders. The settlement was not a military target. It was a water farming collective, about 300 people. The orders came from the 3rd Legion Command, and the 3rd Legion Command was operating on intelligence that suggested the collective was supplying a human resistance cell. A pause. The intelligence was wrong. Marin set down her fork. "I did not complete the order," Gannis said. "I fired on my own commanding officer when he began the execution sequence. I was the only one who did. 300 humans survived because I did not complete my order. I was stripped of my caste marks, branded with the Kethful * scar, and exiled." Another pause, shorter. "The commander I shot survived. He is now a Legion general." The food stall was very quiet. Get had stopped pretending to work. "Kethful Reach," Marin said slowly. The name sat in her memory like a stone. "Water Farming Collective, 11 years ago." Gannis looked at her. "My father ran that collective," Marin said. She said it without drama. It was not a thing she performed. It was simply a fact that had just changed the geometry of the room, and she watched Gannis absorb it with the attention of someone tracking a blade in the air. "The tall man," Gannis said, and it was not quite a question. "Gray at the temples. He stood in the doorway and refused to move. He told his people to go and would not move himself until they had." "That sounds like him." "He was still in the doorway when I pulled the patrol back. I do not know what happened to him after." Marin looked at her ring. "He died the following winter, different reasons, but he got through that day, a breath, because of you." The silence after that was the kind that requires both people to simply sit in it for a moment, without filling it or flinching from it. Then Gannis said, "Why do you carry a war beast carcass over the Ashfield Pass when there is a freight road 2 kilometers west?" "The freight road is patrolled," Marin said. "I was coming from somewhere I wasn't supposed to be." "Which was?" She pulled the medallion from under her shirt and laid it on the table. Gannis went very still. The throat sack went dark, not the darkness of threat, but the darkness of recognition, deep and private, like the closing of a door. "Where did you find this?" she said, and her voice had changed. The warrior caste resonance was still there, but something underneath it had shifted, as though a frequency had been added. "Ashfield Quarantine Zone, Sector 7. Inside a war beast." "Sector 7. Gannis touched the medallion without picking it up, one finger at the rim, tracing the pattern. "There is a structure there, below the rock shelf near the eastern water table. The Dominion sealed it 60 years ago and classified the existence of the sealing." "I know," Marin said. "I found it." "What's inside it?" Marin looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at the marks on Gannis's face, the 3 diagonal cuts that said outcast, that said touched by ruin, that said in the grammar of Veth culture, "Do not stand near this one or her curse will touch you." "I don't know yet," she said, "but I'm going back, and I'd rather not go back alone." They left before the second light, when the garrison patrols were at their thinnest. Get gave them water and dried provisions, and did not ask questions, which was the behavior of someone who had been surviving in the margins for a long time, and understood that the margins had their own ethics. The Ashfields were not, technically, fields. They were a high-altitude plateau of volcanic rock and deep-fissured earth, the remnants of a geological event that the Dominion's records described vaguely as *preoccupation disruption, and that Marin's father had once described, with better accuracy, as * the last thing that happened here before they arrived. The rock was black and red, and the color of old blood, and the air tasted of minerals, and the sky above it was a particular shade of white that made distance impossible to judge. Marin navigated it by instinct and memory. Gannis navigated it by whatever internal compass the Veth warrior caste developed over decades of ranging, and between the two of them they moved faster than either would have alone. They did not talk much during the first hours. The terrain required attention, and they were both, in the private way of experienced soldiers, assessing each other, gauging stride length, reaction time, the small tells of how someone moves when they think no one is watching. What Marin noticed. Gannis favored her right side slightly, protecting the pulse lance graze without being obvious about it. She scanned high and right by default, which meant she'd spent most of her field time in environments where threats came from elevation. She moved quietly for her size, unusually quietly, which meant she had trained for it, which meant she had hunted things that could hear her coming. What Gannis noticed about Marin, she did not say, but her scanning patterns shifted within the first hour to complement rather than overlap. She took the low terrain and left. Marin took high and right, as though they had been briefed on each other's habits. Neither of them acknowledged this. Around midday, they rested in the shadow of a rock formation, eating the dried provisions in the economy of silence that field soldiers use. A Dominion patrol craft moved overhead, distant enough that its sensor sweep would miss them in the rock's thermal shadow. They both pressed back against the stone without being told to, without looking at each other, and held still until the craft's engine sound faded. "The medallion," Gannis said when the sound was gone. "My mother wore one." Marin waited. She was Ketvil line, third generation, her mother before her. The medallions were passed down not through the warrior caste but through what we call the asterisk rememberers, those who kept the lineage records, the accounts of what the world was before the Dominion formalized its hierarchy. Gannis looked at the sky. The Dominion outlawed the asterisk rememberer asterisk tradition 60 years ago, burned the record houses. The medallions were supposed to be surrendered. A pause. "My grandmother hid hers. My mother kept it. When the soldiers came during my exile, they took it. So it ended up in a war beast in a sealed sector," Marin said. "The soldier who took it was assigned to the Ashfield Patrol 2 years later. He is listed as missing." "War beasts are thorough," Marin said. A very small shift in Gannis's posture that Marin was beginning to recognize as the Veth equivalent of a grim smile. They moved on. The structure was where Marin had left it. A dark seam in the rock face, barely visible unless you knew the angle, dropping into a passage that widened to a chamber roughly the size of a garrison hall. The Dominion seals were still in place on the outer passage. She'd found a way through them on her first visit, and the disturbance was small enough that no automated alert had triggered, or if it had, no one had come. The chamber was cold and very dry, which had preserved it. There were records here, not digital, not Dominion format but physical, inscribed on panels of the same not quite metal as the medallion, in a script that she'd been working on for 3 of her 43 days in the Ashfields. She had made partial progress, enough to understand that this was not a Veth structure, enough to understand that it predated the Dominion's presence on this world by something in the range of 1,000 years. Enough to understand that the Dominion knew what it was and had buried it. Gannis stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the panels for a long time without speaking. The throat sac moved through colors that Marin had no reference for, not the standard emotional register she'd mapped, but something deeper and older, the way a frequency can exist below the range of easy hearing, but still move something in the chest. "You can read this," Marin said. It was not quite a question. "Parts of it," Gannis said quietly. "The script is old Ket, older than the current caste script. My grandmother taught me some of it." She moved to the nearest panel and bent close. Her fingers did not touch, held a centimeter away, as though the material were something that required respect. "This is," a long pause, "this is a asterisk lineage anchor, a record of continuity. The asterisk rememberers built these when they believed their records were in danger, meant to survive anything." "What does it say?" Gannis read for a while. Her throat sac moved. She read more. "It says," she said finally, "that the Vethkai and the human settlers on this world arrived within 2 generations of each other. That the first contact between the 2 peoples was," she paused, and something shifted in her voice, "collaborative. That there were rememberers among both species. That the asterisk rememberer asterisk tradition crossed the species boundary, humans and Veth sharing lineage records, the same way the medallions move through family lines regardless of caste. She straightened. It says that the Dominion hierarchy was not the original form of Veth society. It was imposed by a faction 600 years ago that found the collaborative arrangement incompatible with the concept of a subject species. She looked at Marin. There have never been two peoples here. There has been one disrupted people, assigned to two categories. The chamber was very quiet. Marin thought about her father, standing in a doorway, refusing to move until his people were clear. She thought about Ganis, firing on her own commanding officer so that 300 people she didn't know could survive. She thought about the ring on her finger and the medallion under her shirt, and the way some things survived across generations, not because anyone decided to preserve them, but because certain things are too fundamental to die quietly. The Dominion will send someone to investigate eventually, she said. The sealed disturbance. They may already have a flag on it. Yes, Ganis said. We need copies of the panels, everything we can carry. Yes. And then we need to get this information somewhere it can be used. Marin looked around the chamber. There are resistance networks, human ones. I know some of the contact points, and if what's on these panels is what you say it is. There are Veth who have been looking for this for decades, Ganis said. She said it carefully, the way you say something that has weight. Exiles, rememberers who survived the record burnings. A network that the Dominion has spent 60 years trying to eliminate and cannot find because they keep looking for a Veth organization. And it is not only Veth. She paused. I did not know if the human side of the network still existed. I was trying to find evidence of it. Marin looked at her for a long moment. It does, she said. I can vouch for that personally. They worked through what remained of the daylight, making rubbings of the inscribed panels on the fabric they had, and transcribing what Ganis could read in full. Marin worked the far end of the chamber, Ganis the panels nearest the entrance. It was close, careful work, the kind that required a different quality of attention than survival, steadier, slower, the specific focus of someone trying to carry something fragile across difficult terrain. At one point, working on a panel near the chamber's floor, Marin found a small alcove she'd missed on her first visit. Inside it, two more medallions nested together, and beneath them a smaller object, a ring. Not iron but the same not quite metal as the panels, with a pattern along the inside of the band that matched the rim of the medallion. She held it up. Ganis looked over from across the chamber. Even in the low light, Marin could see the throat sac flare bright for a moment. Not a caste color, not an emotional register, but something private and specific, like recognizing a face in a crowd. Ketful * ring, Ganis said. Given at lineage bonding, the equivalent of, she paused, searching. The equivalent of what your people call a marriage bond, but the word is not quite right. It is more like a declaration. I am counted with this person. Whatever they carry, I carry. Whatever marks them, marks me. The rememberers gave them between families who were joining their records. A pause. Between species sometimes. Marin looked at the ring in her palm. She looked at the iron ring on her finger, her father's, her grandfather's, plain and dented and dark. She thought about the marks on Ganis's face that said * cursed and outcast, and do not stand near this one. She was not a person who performed things. She had never been. What she did plainly and without theater, because the world was complicated enough without adding layers of meaning to simple actions. She crossed the chamber and held out the ring. Ganis looked at it, then at her. The throat sac went through 3 colors quickly, surprise, something Marin was fairly sure was the Veth equivalent of alarm, something else that moved through and resolved into a stillness she hadn't seen on the warrior's face before, a stillness that was not frozen. The stillness of something that has been very cold for a long time and has just felt warmth, and is trying to determine whether to trust it. You understand what that means, Ganas said. You explained it clearly, Marin said. Whatever you carry, I carry. Whatever marks you, marks me. She held the ring steady. You've been carrying those marks alone for 11 years. You saved my father's life. You've spent a decade in exile trying to do the right thing in a civilization that branded you for doing it. She kept her eyes on the warrior's face. I'm not offering you pity. I'm offering you a count. I'm saying I am counted with you. If that means the Kethful asterisk marks follow, then they follow. A long silence, longer than any of the silences before it. You have very little fear, Ganas said, and she said it not as a criticism but as an observation, the way you name a quality in something that you have been studying and have only just identified. I have the normal amount of fear, Marin said. I've just had a lot of practice not letting it make decisions. Another silence, then Ganas reached out and took the ring. She didn't put it on her finger. She held it in her palm and closed her fingers around it, the way the asterisk rememberers apparently held the things that mattered, not displayed but kept, not announced but carried. The network you mentioned, she said. How do we reach the contact point? 3 days west if we move carefully. There's a way station at the edge of the Ashfield's human run, off the Dominion maps. We make it there, we can get a message out. Marin looked at the chamber around them, at the panels they'd managed to copy, at the evidence of something the Dominion had spent 60 years trying to ensure no one would find. We go tonight, before anyone comes to check the seals. Ganas nodded. She slipped the ring into the inner pocket of her pack, next to whatever else she kept there, the things too important to be worn openly, too necessary to be left behind. They gathered what they had copied and left the chamber. The 3 days west were not easy. On the first day, they crossed the Ashfield Plateau without incident, moving in the pre-dawn dark when the patrol craft flew higher and the ground-level sensors were at their most degraded. Ganas knew the sensor patterns. She had memorized them during the weeks she'd been circling the region, trying to find the sealed structure, learning the Dominion's routine the way you learn an obstacle course, not by charging through it, but by watching it repeat until you know its rhythm. On the second day, they ran into the patrol. It was not a standard garrison rotation. It was a tracker unit, 4 Veth soldiers in close combat configuration, moving in a search pattern that originated at the sealed chamber. Someone had flagged the sealed disturbance. The tracker unit had been dispatched within hours, which meant someone had been watching for exactly this kind of event, which meant the Dominion was more worried about this particular location than the standard classification level suggested. Marin and Ganas saw them first. They had 2 minutes. There is a gully to the north, Ganas said very quietly. Rock formation that breaks the sensor line, if we move now. They'll hear us on the shale, Marin said. Yes. So we don't use the gully. Marin assessed the terrain with the specific rapid attention that had kept her alive through 43 days in the Ashfields and several years before that. There's a water collection cistern 30 meters southeast. Old construction, Dominion era. Big enough for 2. Ganas looked southeast. That is 30 meters of open ground. I know. Marin pulled the axe from her back. I'll draw them east first. Give me 40 seconds, then move. That is not a plan, Ganas said. That is an improvisation. Yes, Marin agreed and moved. What she did in the next 40 seconds was not complicated, but it required a specific kind of recklessness that humans seem to develop under sufficient pressure. The ability to commit entirely to an action in the knowledge that hesitating will be worse than the action itself. She picked up a fist-sized piece of volcanic rock, hurled it 50 meters east at a natural echo formation that bounced the impact sound in 3 directions simultaneously, then sprinted southwest in the opposite direction. The tracker unit split, the way a search pattern does when it hears a sound but can't immediately locate it. She was in the cistern in 38 seconds. Ganas was there before her. They lay still in the dark, and the smell of old water, while the tracker unit swept the area above them. Two of the soldiers passed within 4 meters. One of them stopped directly overhead and held position for what felt like an unreasonable length of time, long enough for Marin to become aware of every small sound she was making and to stop making them, one by one, working down to the involuntary noise of her own breathing, slowing it, shallowing it, until she was making approximately as much sound as the rock around her. Ganas was completely silent. Completely. She held a stillness that was not rigidity, not the frozen stillness of fear, but the deliberate stillness of a hunter who has been here before, who knows exactly how long this moment is and how to exist inside it without betraying it. The soldier above them moved on. They waited another 20 minutes before moving. 40 seconds, Ganas said, when they were clear and moving west again. You gave yourself 40 seconds for 30 meters of open ground with a tracker unit in sensor range. The math worked out, Marin said. By almost nothing. Almost is enough. Ganas made a sound that Marin couldn't quite classify. After a moment she decided it was laughter, Veth style, not the open sound of it but the contained resonance, the private register. They reached the way station on the 3rd afternoon. It was run by a woman named Sira, who had the specific economy of expression common to people who had been operating in dangerous circumstances for a very long time, not closed, exactly, but calibrated, who said what was necessary and trusted the person across from her to fill in the rest. She looked at Ganas for a long moment when they came through the door, taking in the marks on her face with neither alarm nor particular surprise. Veth network, Marin said. Ketful exile, she has the other half of what we're carrying. Sira nodded once and set out food and water, which was as close as she got to a formal welcome. The message went out that night, through the way station's layered relay system, a network of contact points that looked, from the outside, like ordinary freight and water management traffic, and which had been running for 11 years without the Dominion finding it. The message contained coordinates, a summary of the chamber's contents, and a phrase in Old Ket script that Ganas provided from memory, a recognition signal for the Veth side of the network, one that hadn't been used in 6 years because no one had been certain there was anyone left to use it. The reply came before dawn. There were people on the other end, more than expected. The Veth exile network had been waiting for something to hold, something to anchor. The lineage anchor at Sector 7 was exactly what that phrase meant in practical terms. Something to build toward. Something to point to when you were trying to explain to people, Veth or human, why the current order of things was not inevitable. Why it had a beginning and therefore could have an end. Sira read the reply twice and then looked up at both of them with an expression that was still calibrated, still economical, but had something in it that Marin recognized. The particular quality of attention that people have when they have been doing hard work in the dark for a long time, and something has just changed the weight of it. There will be a meeting, Sira said, 3 weeks. Western Reach at the old water processing site. Both networks, full contact. She paused. They are asking if you will come. Both of us, Marin said. The message specified. Sira looked at Ganas. They asked for the exile commander who fired on her superior officer 11 years ago. Word has apparently traveled. She looked at Marin. And the human from the Ashfields who walked into a garrison carrying a war beast and came out with records that changed the foundational history of Dominion occupation. A pause. Their words, not mine. Ganas was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her pack and took out the ring and held it in her palm and looked at it. My grandmother believed that the Rememberer's asterisk, tradition would outlast the Dominion, she said. She believed it without evidence. She believed it the way, she paused, searching. The way your people seem to believe things that have not yet been proven but feel structurally necessary, as though the shape of the world requires them to be true. Hope, Marin said. Yes, Ganas said, that is the word. Before the Western Reach meeting, there was the matter of getting there. The route the network had agreed on required 3 relay points across the lowland territory between the Ashfields and the Reach's western settlement belt. Each relay point was a different kind of safe house. A freight depot whose owner had been quietly falsifying cargo manifests for 6 years. A water processing substation maintained by a human technician who had worked out early in her career that the Dominion's administrative oversight did not extend to the sewage infrastructure, and a decommissioned Veth cast house that had been empty for 40 years, and that no one in the local garrison could quite bring themselves to requisition. Because decommissioned cast houses were the site of certain rituals that the warrior caste still felt vaguely superstitious about, which Marin found both useful and quietly delightful. Ganas navigated the cast house with the specific attentiveness of a person returning to a place that has been changed. She walked through the empty ceremonial hall and touched nothing, but her eyes moved over everything: the faded wall markings, the stripped altar frames, the places where offerings had once been placed according to practices that the Dominion had officially characterized as primitive and had practically tolerated, because it was easier to let the warrior caste have their old rituals than to deal with the alternative. My grandmother was a *rememberer* in a house like this one, she said, in the decommissioned hall with the light coming thin through dust-covered skylights. Not a warrior caste house, a record house, but the architecture is the same. The Dominion built standardization into everything, including the sacred spaces. She looked up at the skylight. Easier to decommission a thing if every version of it looks the same. Efficient, Marin said. Yes, Ganas was quiet for a moment. That is the Dominion's core competency, making things efficient, removing what complicates the accounting. She turned from the skylight. Your people know this already. You have lived it. We have, Marin said. The question is always what you do with knowing it. What did your father do? Marin thought about it. He kept records, she said. He kept the Water Collective's records going back 4 generations: births, deaths, planting cycles, water table measurements, all of it. He said it was practical, but I think he knew that practical was just the form it took. That what he was actually doing was saying, we were here, and we matter, and the shape of what happened here is not up to the people who would prefer a simpler accounting. Ganas looked at her with the expression that Marin had come to understand was the Veth equivalent of something moving through her, not emotion displayed, but emotion registered. He and my grandmother would have understood each other, she said. I think they would have, Marin agreed. They slept in the ceremonial hall, the decommissioned holy place of a tradition the Dominion had tried to make manageable, and in the morning they moved on to the Reach. The Western Reach meeting lasted 3 days. On the first day there was the careful and exhausting work of establishing trust, not between Marin and Ganas, who had already done that in the Ashfields with a warbeast carcass and a flooded cistern, but between the 2 networks that had been operating in parallel for 11 years without knowing the other existed. The human network had assumed the Veth exile community was fragmented and survivalist, focused on individual endurance rather than organized resistance. The Veth exile network had assumed the human resistance cells were primarily reactive, responding to Dominion aggression rather than working toward any coherent alternative. Both assumptions had been partially correct and almost entirely wrong in the way that assumptions about people you have never actually met tend to be. On the second day, they looked at the records from the chamber. Ganas translated in sections, with a human linguist named Chorus who had spent 12 years working on Old Ket script from the fragments that had survived the record burnings. Between them, they moved through the panels systematically, and the room which had started the second day with the particular tension of people who were hoping for something and were afraid to want it too much shifted over the course of 8 hours into something different. Not celebration, exactly. Not triumph. Something quieter and more durable. the specific quality of attention that people have when something they believed without evidence has just been given evidence, and they find that belief and proof together feel different from either alone. On the third day, they argued about what to do next. Marin let most of the argument go without joining it, which was her habit. She found that the best thinking in a room happened when she was listening rather than speaking, and that most arguments resolved themselves faster if she waited for the point where people had exhausted the positions they'd entered the room with and were starting to locate the positions they actually held. The argument ran through three major phases. A first phase focused on immediate security, a second phase on long-term strategy, and a third phase, shorter, more intense, on what it would mean to release the chamber records publicly, and who would receive that meaning and how. It was in the third phase that Ganna spoke. She stood, which was not what any of the seated Veth in the room expected, and the change in register, warrior caste, standing, full height, shifted the room's attention in the physical way that height and stillness can shift a room. We have spent 2 days correctly identifying that the records change the foundation of the Dominion's historical justification, she said. We have correctly identified the risk of releasing them. We have not identified something equally important. She paused. The records are not primarily a weapon. They are a mirror. The question of releasing them is not a question of whether the Dominion can survive the reflection. The Dominion will survive. Institutions survive everything in the short term. The question is whether the people inside the institution, the soldiers, the administrators, the caste members who enforce the hierarchy because they have been told it is the natural order of things, whether those people can survive seeing clearly what they are enforcing and why. A silence. Some of them will not be able to, she continued. Some of them will not want to. Some of them will do what I did 11 years ago when I had a set of orders and a doorway full of people and a choice. She looked around the room. The records do not win the argument by themselves. Nothing does. But they give the people inside the argument something to point at when they are trying to explain to themselves why they are choosing differently. A pause. My grandmother built things to last because she believed a future was coming that would need them. I am standing here because she was right. I am standing here because a human woman found what my grandmother buried and knew it mattered and did not leave it in the dark. She looked at Marin briefly, then back to the room. We release the records. We release them widely, redundantly, in every format and through every channel we have access to. And then we continue the work, because the records are not the end. They are the reason there is a continuing to do. Nobody argued after that. The release took 4 weeks to execute properly, not because the technical mechanism was complicated, but because they wanted it done in a way that could not be traced back to any single node in the network, which required a level of coordination that was, as Chorus put it, like trying to start a fire with 40 people each responsible for one spark. But they managed it, in the way that patient and careful people manage things that require patience and care. The chamber records went out on a Dominion shipping route's secondary communication bandwidth, the kind of channel used for routine cargo manifests and administrative notices, low-priority traffic that no one was actively monitoring. They went out simultaneously from 11 different relay points. They went out in Old Ket script and in the 6 most widely spoken human trade languages, and in the formal Veth administrative script, which was a particular choice, because the formal administrative script was the language of the hierarchy itself, the language in which the Dominion's founding documents were written, the language in which its laws were codified and its orders were given. Reading that the Dominion's hierarchy was not the original form of Veth's social organization, in the language the hierarchy used to describe itself, produced a specific quality of cognitive disruption that Marin had read about once in a pre-Dominion linguistics text and had recognized immediately as what she needed. The general's response was swift and thorough, and completely insufficient for the scale of the problem. He locked down the Ashfield corridor. He sent tracker units to the 11 relay points, found them all empty. He issued a system-wide suppression order on the channel bandwidth, which required a formal authorization from the Dominion Council, which required the Council to acknowledge that they knew what the records contained, which required a Council session that was, apparently, conducted at high volume and without any consensus for the first time in 30 years. He issued a counter-statement characterizing the records as forgeries, which required Dominion historians to examine the material in the records, which required the Dominion historians to testify about what they found, and the testimony of Dominion historians about the age and authenticity of pre-Dominion cultural records was not a thing that the suppression apparatus had been designed to handle. Marin heard most of this through the network's relay system, sitting in way stations and freight depots and decommissioned sacred spaces, and she thought, this is what it looks like when you flood the right chamber. Not an explosion, a slow, inexorable movement of something that was always there, given enough pressure to go where it needed to go. The general came to Vethsal Crossing 3 weeks after the release, personally, which meant he was either very confident or very afraid, and Marin had enough experience with Dominion Command to know those two things often looked identical from the inside. She was not in Vethsal Crossing when he arrived. She was watching from the ridge above the garrison, in the pre-dawn dark, with Ganis beside her, both of them flat on the cold rock, watching the patrol configurations shift as the general's escort settled into the garrison perimeter. He's pulled everything in close, Marin said quietly, defensive posture. He does not know where the threat is coming from, Ganis said. He is used to threats that come from a direction. We don't come from a direction. No, the throatsack moved through colors that were calm and deliberate. We come from inside the accounting. Below them, the garrison lights shifted as the patrol rotations changed. The general was in there somewhere, doing what command does when it has lost the kind of control it thought it had, trying to redraw the perimeter, trying to identify where the leak was, not yet understanding that the leak was not a location, that the records were not something you could flood back into a chamber, that you could not unring what had already been rung. There will be more of this, Marin said. It was not a question. Yes, Ganis said, for a long time. Are you, Marin paused, choosing the word carefully, are you steady for it? Ganis turned and looked at her in the dark. The bioluminescence in her throat was very low, the private frequency, the one Marin associated with moments when Ganis was not performing anything, not holding any cast posture, just present. I have been waiting 11 years to be useful in a direction rather than merely surviving in all of them, she said. I am steady. Marin nodded. She looked down at the garrison, at the general's defensive perimeter, at the insufficient walls around an already crossed threshold, and she thought about a ring in a chamber that had been waiting in the dark for 60 years, and about all the things that wait in the dark for someone to notice they are still there. Then let's get back, she said. There's more to do tomorrow. They moved off the ridge the way they'd moved through the ash fields, through the cistern, through the 3 days west. Quietly, efficiently, like two people who have learned each other's pace and don't need to discuss it anymore, who have found that the mathematics of moving together is simpler and more reliable than the mathematics of moving alone. The meeting at the Western Reach was the beginning of a thing that took years to become what it became. History is like that. It looks, from the outside, as though it moves in sudden shifts, as though there are moments of transformation that arrive like weather. From the inside, it is mostly people in cold rooms reading each other carefully, deciding over and over again whether to trust, deciding over and over again to do the work even when the work has no guaranteed return. Marin was not a leader by temperament or preference. She was, by nature and training, someone who moved through difficult terrain and did not stop. She brought that to the network meetings, to the long arguments over strategy, to the moments when the whole enterprise seemed to be balanced on nothing at all and about to fall. She brought the specific quality of a person who has spent 43 days alone in a hostile environment and come out the other side carrying a war beast. Not fearless, but genuinely unimpressed by the fear. Ganis was not a diplomat. She was a warrior caste Veth exile with the marks of asterisk Kethful on her face, which meant that every room she walked into had to recalibrate. She brought to the meetings the thing that turned out to matter most in the early years: the ability to say, clearly and without apology, "I know what the Dominion is capable of because I was part of it, and I chose not to be, and here is what that cost me, and I am telling you it was worth it." There was no argument, on either side, that could outlast that particular statement when delivered by someone wearing the marks of the choice. They worked well together, which Sira observed and did not comment on directly, but which she catalogued in the careful way that people who run networks catalog things that will matter later. 3 months after the Western Reach meeting, the Dominion sent a general to Vethsal Crossing with orders to locate and contain what Dominion intelligence was calling a * cross-species sedition network. The general's name, in the Dominion's records, was listed as formerly the commanding officer of the Ketville Reach Patrol. His current rank was a consequence of a career built on efficient enforcement. He was a man who understood power primarily as the distance between himself and the people below him, which meant he had never quite learned to account for people who had nothing left to lose. He sent tracker units into the ashfields to find the chamber. They found the Dominion seals, broken and rewelded. They found no records, no medallions, no evidence of recent occupation. What they found was a flooded chamber. The eastern water table, carefully compromised from below, had filled it completely and silted the inscribed panels under half a meter of sediment. The records were not destroyed. They had been copied in their entirety and distributed to 6 separate locations, in formats that the Dominion scanning equipment was not calibrated to read. The flooding had been Marin's design, worked out on the 3rd day in the ashfields when she'd first mapped the water table and thought, if I needed to protect something here, how would I do it? Not because she had a plan, because the question interested her. The general sent more units into the population centers, looking for the network's contact points. He found the way stations one by one, each one empty, cleanly evacuated, no materials left behind, no evidence of communication protocols. What he did not find was the network itself, because the network had shifted in the 3 months since Western Reach from a series of physical locations to something that did not have a physical location. A shared understanding, distributed among enough people that removing any part of it would not remove the whole. The rememberers had built things to last. The meeting that Marin remembered most clearly, years later, was not one of the large ones. It was not the Western Reach gathering or the second network convergence in the Ketville lowlands, or the night they broadcast the lineage anchor records on the Dominion's own communication network, and the general's career ended in the subsequent emergency session. It was a smaller meeting, in the way station at the edge of the ashfields, late enough in the season that the plateau was cold, and the light came in low and amber through the way station's one small window. Ganis was sitting across from her, working on a translation of a panel section she'd been refining for 2 months. The ring, the Kethful asterisk ring from the chamber, was on the table between them, next to the iron ring that Marin had set down while she worked, because the iron ring's weight on her finger was familiar enough that she felt its absence like a question, and had learned to use that small discomfort as a reminder to pay attention. "Your grandmother," Marin said. Did she believe it because she'd seen evidence or because she needed to? Ganis considered the question the way she considered all questions, with full attention, without rushing. "I think," she said finally, "that she believed it because she had done the mathematics and found that it was the only configuration in which things came out correctly, not the way a wish comes out correctly. The way a structure does." She looked at the panel section. The asterisk rememberers recorded everything, not because they expected to win, because they could not account for the world in which they lost. The structure of the record required a future that could receive it. Marin looked at the iron ring. She thought about her father in the doorway. She thought about a Veth woman she had never met, sitting in whatever darkness exile put her in, deciding not to complete an order. She thought about the slow mathematics of a thing that takes generations to build and cannot be completed by anyone who begins it. She picked up the asterisk Kethvil asterisk ring and held it out. Gannis looked at her. "You've been carrying it in your pocket for 8 months, Marin said. "I think that's long enough to verify that whatever we're offering each other is real." Gannis looked at the ring in Marin's palm. The throat sac moved through a color that Marin now knew well had been learning for 8 months, with the same careful attention she brought to everything that mattered. It was the color that meant, "I am here. I am decided. I am not going anywhere." She reached out and took the ring and put it on her hand. Marin put her iron ring back on her own finger. In the way station's amber light, with the ash fields cold and quiet outside the window and the records of 1,000-year disruption spread between them on the table, it was the most ordinary thing in the world. 2 people with different faces and different languages and different marks on their skin, deciding to be counted together. That was how it usually started. That was how it always had started, according to the asterisk rememberers' asterisk records, not with declarations or battles or the large shapes of history, with a person in a doorway refusing to move, with a soldier who fired in the wrong direction and called it the right one, with a ring put on a hand, by someone who had been told the hand was cursed and had done the calculation and found that the mathematics did not support the conclusion. Outside, the ash field stretched away under a darkening sky. Somewhere in Sector 7, the water table was doing what water tables do, moving steadily, quietly, carrying things across the rock, keeping what it carried intact. The records were out in the world now, distributed and alive. The general was explaining himself to a Dominion Council that was, for the first time in its existence, receiving questions it did not have prepared answers for. The network was building, and the rememberers were recording, and the structure of the thing required a future to receive it. The structure of the thing required a future. Marin Solis thought that was a good enough reason to make one. She thought about what it would cost. She was not a person who avoided that calculation. She'd been running it her whole life, in the water collective where every resource had a price and every choice had a consequence. In the years after the collective burned, when she had survived by being rigorously honest about what things cost and whether she could afford them. The network would cost time and safety, and the kind of ordinary life that had never quite been available to her anyway, but that she sometimes imagined the shape of, late at night, the way you imagine rooms in a house you've never lived in. It would cost proximity to danger, which she had always managed but had never quite gotten used to, because getting used to it was the thing that got people killed. It would cost the comfortable fiction that the large shapes of history happen to people other than yourself. What it would not cost her, she was increasingly certain, was the thing she had been afraid it might. She had grown up with the understanding, half-taught, half-absorbed from the air of the settlements, that humans and Veth were fundamentally opposed. Not enemies in the way of 2 peoples in an active conflict, but incompatible in the way of 2 things that occupy the same space and cannot both fully exist in it. The Dominion had not invented this understanding. They had inherited it from the original faction that had formalized the hierarchy, and they had refined it over 6 centuries into something that felt like natural law, like the way water runs downhill, like something that required no enforcement because it was simply the shape of the world. The records said otherwise. The records said that the shape of the world had been changed deliberately by people with an interest in that particular shape, and that the original configuration had been different, messier, more complicated, less legible to an administrative system that needed clear categories, but more honest about what the two peoples actually were to each other. The Rememberers had known this. They had built the records specifically so that this knowledge could not be made to disappear, even if everyone who held it was made to disappear. They had understood something about the mathematics of information that the Dominion had apparently failed to fully account for, that an idea, once given a durable physical form and hidden well enough, becomes patient in a way that human and Veth institutions are not. The records had outlasted the record houses. They had outlasted the *rememberer* tradition as an active practice. They had outlasted the people who made them, and the people who hid them, and the 6 generations of people who did not know they were there. They had waited, and someone had come. Marin looked at the iron ring on her finger, worn smooth on the inside from years of skin against metal, and thought about what it meant to carry something. Her father had not been a dramatic man. He had not, as far as she knew, believed himself to be part of a lineage that mattered in any scale larger than the collective. The water table, the seasonal planting records he had kept with meticulous care since before she was born. He had stood in a doorway because the doorway needed standing in, and because his people needed time to clear, and because the mathematics of the situation were simple and did not require a speech. He had worn the ring because it was his father's, and his father's before that, all the way back to the first generation of settlers who had come to this world with almost nothing and built, slowly, in the difficult soil of a place that had not asked for them, something that could last. Ganas closed the translation and sat back. The amber light had shifted, moving lower, the way light moves in late afternoon when the day is deciding to become evening. The way station was quiet. Somewhere outside, the network was moving, messages in transit, people at relay points, the slow distributed work of a thing that had no center and therefore could not be taken out at the center. "I have been thinking," Ganas said, "about the structure of the Rememberer * tradition." "What about it?" "About why it worked." She looked at the translation. "They built redundancy into everything. Not because they assumed the worst, because they were honest about the range of what was possible and they designed for the full range." She paused. "Most institutions design for the best case. They plan for success and treat failure as a deviation. The Rememberers designed for failure. They assumed their houses would burn, their records would be seized, their practitioners would be exiled or killed. They built as though all of those things were inevitable and asked only that the records survive them." She looked at Marin. "Your father kept records." "He did." "He did not expect them to survive the burning. He kept them anyway." "He said once," Marin said, "that the point of a record was not to guarantee a future. The point was to make the future possible if one arrived. You do what you can do, and then the world does what it does, and sometimes what you built is still there when someone needs it." She looked at the *Kethful* ring on Ganas's hand and the iron ring on her own and thought, "Yes, that is exactly right. You do what you can do. You build for the range. You make the future possible if one arrives, and then you keep working, because the working is the thing, not the arrival, not the completion, not the final accounting in which all debts are settled and all records confirmed. The working, the daily practice of refusing to accept that the shape of the world is fixed, the patient and unglamorous and absolutely necessary act of continuing." Outside, the ash fields were cooling toward dark. Inside, 2 people who had been counted together for 8 months and would be counted together for considerably longer sat in the amber light and continued the work, which was all that any of them had ever been able to do, and which had always, in the end, been enough.